Therefore, by Hercules, a civilized life is impossible without salt, and so necessary is this basic substance that its name is applied metaphorically even to intense mental pleasures. So declared the ancient Roman writer Pliny the Elder when considering the essential nature of marine salt to civilization and civilized life. What he meant is that the commodity itself is so necessary, but also so congenial to life, that the word itself, in Latin the word sal, was metaphorically also used to describe what he calls intense mental pleasures, by which he means wit, humour, a sharp and engaging conversational style, and intellectual acuity. Salt has clearly fallen through the gaps of time and culture. A quick glance in the Cambridge Dictionary will tell you what you already know if you're at all aware of common parlance today. Salty, these days, means variously annoyed, aggravated, and impolite. The dictionary gives such examples as, I don't know why she's acting so salty, and he got salty with me because I wouldn't go out with him, and other variations of salty wit, salty language, and salty jokes. None of which is particularly flattering or desirable, but I suppose the language has changed because our cultural perception of the commodity has also changed dramatically over time. And this is something we need to bear in mind and think more about in this episode, in which we meet the divinity the ancient Romans called the Salty One. In the past couple of episodes, we met Juturna, Rome's divine nymph of healing fresh water, and Mephitis, the sulphurous swamp goddess of broiling noxious fumes. In this episode, we'll meet the Roman goddess of salt water. She's another divine water nymph, supposedly, this time a Nereid. That's a nymph of the surging sea, but she's also a goddess that has been so conflated with Greek ideas and Greek mythology that I think her own Roman character has long been obscured, and, in fact, continues to be obscured. Here is another deity, then, very much in the shadows of Olympus. To rescue her from the obscurity in which she languishes, we'll need to do a bit of historical detective work and a fair bit of lateral thinking. We'll put her in context in Roman society to see where she belonged and what we might deduce, and tentatively to try to reconstruct something of her old, divine, and salty self. So to the sea, the bountiful sea we go, to old Neptune's shining kingdom of the foam. Triton announces our arrival with a blast on his conch-shell trumpet, and a wondrous world of fishes and mermen, fins and flashing scales and crab claws await, and beneath the waves we must wander. Come, the water's lovely. Let us plunge into the glistening, briny realm of Salacia. The world beneath the waves has always been a realm beyond our reach. We might hold our breath and visit a brief while, but it's not our element. We can't breathe down there, and we must come up for air. So the realm below the sea has always been a realm beyond us, a place that attracts us to its very edge, but upon reaching its breaking shores, one where we can only stand and look out and wonder as the waves lap around our ankles. Or, if on an ancient ship putting out to sea, a place where we might nervously look to the horizon, hoping to set our feet on land again, and soon. The sea has therefore always been a place that sparks our imaginations, a world where life might be quite different to the one we know in our own terrestrial existence. And as you all know, for Romans, this underwater kingdom belonged to Neptune, the great lord of the sea, or if you must make Greek comparisons, Poseidon. And just as Amphitrite was Poseidon's wife in the Greek view, so Salacia was the much lesser known wife of Neptune in the Roman view. Or at least that's who she became, because the Roman goddess Salacia was identified with the Greek Amphitrite in ancient times, and that conflation meant that Salacia absorbed the Greek mythological narrative surrounding her. But it is, as always, ridiculous to suggest that Roman religion borrowed or stole the Greek goddess and simply gave her a Roman name. As has so often been apparent in this series, what seems regularly to have happened is that the attractive Greek mythology that came to cling to some Roman gods brought to that previous numinous divine entity a human form, an iconography and a backstory, and these are what become visible and memorable in the archaeological record, and these superficial trappings obscure for us the actual deity and the history beneath. We mistake the map for the territory. In other words, what I'm saying is that Salacia was a pre-existing Roman goddess with her own place and local culture and tradition. But since it was the Roman habit, wherever they met foreign deities, to equate them with a deity they already knew and worshipped, the closest Roman equivalent to Amphitrite, the queen of the sea, must have been Salacia. And this equivalence having been made, however, and since narratives and attractive visuals are particularly persuasive and alluring to human minds, so the mythology and art of Amphitrite did indeed carry across to Salacia, and it stuck. So it is now that many of the dubious authorities in the babble of internet wisdom will tell you that Salacia is Amphitrite, or that she was simply the Roman counterpart to Amphitrite, or worse, that the Romans stole Amphitrite and gave her this Roman branding. So if you've been following along with us for a while in this series, you'll know very well that I'm going to reject all of this entirely. But since Salacia did take on the mantle of Amphitrite, let's look at her mythology first and her stories shared across the Greco-Roman world. So, it was said that Salacia, aka Amphitrite, was a Nereid, a sea nymph of exquisite beauty. So gorgeous was she that while she was dancing joyously with her fellow sister nymphs, she attracted the amorous attentions of Neptune himself. And Neptune, desirous of her hand in marriage, tried to charm her and win her over. But she was shy and wanted to maintain her chastity, and so she fled to far-off Atlas and the seas at the far edges of the world. But of course, Neptune was persistent, and he had his own powers in his briny kingdom. He sent out his dolphin messengers as scouts to search the seas and find her, which they did, and the dolphins, with their own charming ways, softened her heart to the message from the Lord of the Sea. And so, persuaded, Salacia, aka Amphitrite, agreed to ride on the back of the dolphins back to Neptune to accept his proposal in marriage. And so they were wed to the dancing of all the waves of the sea, and all the treasures of Neptune's coral palace were hers. She's the beautiful female companion you often see riding beside Neptune in his sea chariot, But in art, you'll also see her riding dolphins, and you can recognize her variously with trident in hand or nets in hair, sometimes a wreath of seaweed, and sometimes sporting crab claws on her brow or a crab upon her head. As Neptune's wife, she became the divine queen of the sea, the goddess of the blue glancing seas, as Homer called her, who moves light of foot on the misty face of the open water. As Hesiod wrote, a beautiful goddess who easily stills the water and hushes the winds in their blowing. Although serene, like the sea, she wasn't necessarily quiet, and she's often also described as murmuring, moaning, or even roaring. Pausanias, for example, quoted an oracle calling her blue-eyed Amphitrite roaring over the wine-dark sea. And so we find Salacia, in Latin, in descriptions of the fantastical realms of the sea, in Roman terms, such as this particularly beautiful description from Apuleius of what the goddess Venus saw upon entering the underwater kingdom, and you'll note here the Roman names. The sea nymphs were there, singing a choral song. Portunus, the god of harbours, with his sea-green beard. Note, he is a specifically Roman god, and we'll meet him soon. But here she comes. Salacia, Neptune's wife, her lap alive with fish, and Palaemon, the dolphin's little charioteer. Troops of tritons, too, leapt here and there in the water. One blew softly on a melodious conch, while another, with a silk parasol, shielded her from the sun's hostile blaze. Another held a mirror to his mistress's eyes, while yet more swam harnessed in pairs to her chariot. Such was the throng escorting Venus as she moved out to sea. Although Salacia sometimes seems herself like a Venus of the sea, a glowing pearl in the lap of the waves, here she is with a lap full of fish, recalling Book 11 of the Odyssey when Homer calls her Amphitrite, who nourishes the fishes in numbers past all counting. For all her beauty, she was always also otherworldly in terms of her strange and sometimes slimy underwater domain. Her offspring were all manner of sea creatures. Triton himself was her son, but the fish too were hers, as were seals and dolphins, and many sea monsters were also her children. So when Odysseus was getting cast about at sea, he could assert his fear that out of the brine he might get attacked by a ketos, which he describes as one of the swarming, strange, huge creatures in the breeding grounds of Amphitrite. Teeming marine breeding grounds are at once bounteous but slightly off-putting too, a bit like the kelp crown the queen of the sea sometimes wears. So in the late 2nd century or so, we can also find one writer musing about all the shellfish which feed at the bottom of the sea. Sea snails, conchs, giant clams and mussels, slimy offspring of Amphitrite. So much for myth. You can see that she's quite irresistible, and her artistic representation continues to be, in my own opinion, some of the most beguiling from the ancient world. This was certainly how Roman society came to envision their own Salacia, and this was certainly the backstory that accrued to her, and so this is the shared Greco-Roman vision of the Queen of the Sea. But turning to the question I posed earlier, where do the similarities end? Where does the overlap part and just become a gap through which we can see what all those stories and descriptions inadvertently conceal? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here and tell you what I think, but please be clear that these are my own ideas and not something that you'll find in any publication that I know of. And that's because I'm about to make an argument built on conjecture and speculation, which is never a great basis for history. But in my defense, this comes from contextual evidence and a sound knowledge of the larger landscape of ancient Roman religion and some of its patterns. And this is, of course, the landscape that we've been exploring in this series, which will be increasingly familiar to those lovely viewers who have been keeping me company as we go along. So I'll tell you what I think, and as always, I'd love to hear in the comments your thoughts and response. So, my foothold into this speculative territory is in the very name of the goddess. She's called Salacia, and it comes from the Latin word sal, for salt, and strictly speaking it means something like saltiness, so it can be translated fairly as the salty one, and that's a very specific characteristic. It's indicative, of course, of the salty domain of the sea, and her saltiness could just refer to the sea in a broad and more generalized sense, but it needn't be, right? Indeed, when you think about a lot of the indigenous Roman deities we've covered, many have very specific functional domains: orchards, harvests, crop rust and vines, and many were associated with very specific professions, as we've seen, like the beehives and bread ovens, dung heaps and funeral pyres. So in that logic of religious domain specificity, it wouldn't be unusual, and perhaps we might even suspect that it was once upon a time, specifically saltiness itself, that Salacia was and represented. To be more blunt, what if she had once been a goddess of salt and salt production? This thought instantly moves us with a bit of a thud out of that jovial, bejeweled and splashing divine kingdom under the sea, and moves us very directly, if less fancifully, into the realm of busy human industry. All over the coasts of its empire, Rome was busy panning salt, and wherever it was to be found inland, there too Roman contractors were mining rock salt. As we started out noting with Pliny in the introduction, salt was the mark and foundation of civilized life. This, Pliny stated, was simply impossible without salt. Now, in our times of hypertension and kidney stones, a life without salt might sound like an excellent health goal, but as you all know, for humans, salt is actually a biological necessity. Our bodies need it to survive. Without it, you enter a world of pain and problems and eventually even death. So while it's harmful in excess, deficiency is actually deadly. And this is something we barely consider because almost everyone consumes far too much salt nowadays. And part of the reason we have all these salt-induced health problems is because our industrially processed salt is so very cheap, so easy to find, and it's in absolutely everything that isn't a fruit or vegetable in the grocery store. Avoiding salt now is about as painstaking as it used to be to procure it. Roman society was very concerned about and involved in salt production from its earliest beginnings. You may have heard the story that we get our word salary in English from the Latin word for salt because the Roman legions used to be paid in salt. But, sorry to do the myth-busting, folks, but this isn't true. The troops wanted money and were in it for the denarii, just like everyone else. Some people, not historians, have tried to modify this and say that some part of the military wage was set aside for a salt ration or something like that, but that's also not true. What is true, and where all these rumours originate, is from Pliny the Elder, the one and only, who did say that he thought that's where the word originated. Now, he was writing in the 1st century CE, and he was looking far back into the mists of time from that already ancient vantage point. In other words, he was looking back into times long before the Roman legions or anything that even resembled Rome as we know it. Now, on that time frame, I'm more sympathetic and inclined to at least entertain the idea that salt had once in the hazy past been a commodity in which you might get paid, because we're talking about a pre-monetary society without mints and coins which bartered and exchanged goods and services. In that world, salt might very well have been a desirable commodity alongside, wool and chickens. But in that world, there was nothing like an organised standing army either. However, there may have been a lingering memory in Rome that salt had once been used alongside other commodities in lieu of currency, and probably that's true. What is certainly true is that in the earliest days for which we have historical records in Rome, we do find a city quite preoccupied with salt, its extraction, export, and monopoly. So, for example, the old road that stretched from the Forum Boarium in Rome and out a gate in the Aurelian walls, tellingly called the Porta Salaria, was itself called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. This road ran into Sabine territory and out to the other coast on the other side on the Tyrrhenean Sea, and derived its name from the fact that salt was exported out of Rome and along this road. But it was a very old road, and it had been a trackway long before it was paved and straightened up by Roman engineering, and its name came from its function. At the mouth of the Tiber River, near the coast, there were abundant salt marshes, and the Sabines used to take the pre-Roman trackway to fetch salt from here, and the presence of salt is even thought by some to have helped determine the original site and growth of the city of Rome itself. And Rome took on its production at scale. There were salt warehouses on Rome's Aventine Hill, the Salinae. The marshy lagoons of the ancient coastal Mediterranean were the perfect environment for salt, and rivalry over neighbouring salt works might have caused some of Rome's earliest conflicts with its neighbours. Rome's mythic kings were credited with establishing the city's first salt works, also called Salinae, and even in the myth there seems to have been rivalry around control of them that seems echoed in tensions in historical time. It must also be said that alongside the human and animal biological necessity for salt, there was also a religious need, because in every single public sacrifice in the city, a special concoction called the mola salsa needed to be sprinkled on the sacrificial victim by the officiating priest. This was carefully prepared by the Vestal virgins, and it consisted of a mixture of milled spelt and salt water. Mola salsa literally means salted groats. For Pliny, the utter centrality and necessity of salt for life in the city of Rome was proven by the fact that this concoction was required for all the public sacrifices by which the state maintained harmony with its gods. And sacrificial meal aside, and also quite aside from the fact that it made your food taste better, salt preserved your food in a hot climate with no refrigerators. It cured meat and made it last longer. And who could forget that stinking salty fish sauce, the notorious garum, which the Romans adored and which we love to imagine with disgust. Though, to be honest, I think I'd have quite liked it. Anyway, I could go on, but perhaps I've already said enough for the point to be clear enough. With all this historical importance of salt and all this salty behaviour, with all these places and rituals and accommodations for salt, are we to imagine that the goddess whose name is salt and saltiness itself was of no particular importance? Are we really to imagine that the salty one was off dancing beneath the waves somewhere far off and disinterested in the affairs of the city? And are we really to imagine that Salacia was just a Roman rebranding of Greek Amphitrite, borrowed or stolen because the myth was nice and Neptune needed a wife? I find it hard to believe. We've seen often enough how the natural places and things that sustained Roman life were always imbued with the numinous. On the marshy banks of the Tiber, with the shining sea beyond, and the sustaining salts glistening and evaporating into the very landscape, do we not think the presence of a deity was felt there, and that the deity perceived was surely the goddess of salt, Salacia? And do we not think that the people who worked those salty places didn't hear her name in the trade they plied, the salinatores, the salt producers and traders, the sacarii salarii, who hulked the sacks of salt around, and all the different members of the Salt Workers Association, the societas salinatorum, surely did not pass Salacia by without thinking that the queen of the sea, who was the source of all their salt, was not also the divine sponsor of their livelihoods? So it's all speculation. I know of no inscriptions or telltale dedications to prove it. But, as the archaeologists are always fond of saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And you might remember from other episodes that other deities involved in other trades have often almost escaped the radar, but for some accidental survival of evidence here or there, a few words, an inscription, a named image. And then at least we see them dimly and know at least that they're there. But how many others have vanished without a trace? And we've seen that sometimes this is simply because of the random ravages of time, but sometimes it's because of the relatively lowly station of the people involved, whose lives and concerns rarely make it into the historical record, let alone into the literary prose and highfalutin poetic musings of the elite few. The lives and concerns of the salt workers were in this category. And maybe, surely, Salacia was in their minds, since they were so much in the realm of Salacia. But Salacia hasn't vanished like some of those other vanished gods. We see her and hear about her more clearly in later sources, in the Rome that seems more familiar to us, but only because she's taken on this Greek mantle and thus has a mythological story to tell. I think she has a historical story to tell also, if only we could find it. In fact, even the Roman salt works themselves are quite difficult to find in the archaeology, and though we do have traces of a few around the Mediterranean, we know that there were squillions. And if the physical places are all but gone, I suppose the ethereal presence of the divine entity who once inhabited those places is even harder to locate. I will say, though, just to conclude my argument for an old Roman goddess of the salty sea who originally had nothing to do with Amphitrite, that the name Amphitrite comes from the Greek amphis, meaning around or surrounding, and tris, which means third. And the name literally translates as something like the encircling third. This is somewhat obscure, but it's thought to relate to the peripheral seas encircling the known world. In other words, Amphitrite was actually distant by definition. And moreover, her name had absolutely nothing to do with salt. Nevertheless, if a counterpart to that great Greek ocean queen was to be found among the Romans, It was to be the salty goddess Salacia herself, because she too was a powerful deity presiding over the seas, and some Roman sources even say that she was the energy and surge in its motion. So, in broad strokes, the parallel was easy enough to draw. And maybe one further little hint of tangential evidence for my argument is to be found in the idea, seemingly fairly well supported in the ancient evidence, that Neptune, on the other hand, was actually once a king of fresh waters, not the sea. And his identity morphed over time due to his conflation with Poseidon. And he thus became the divine ruler of the sea, and so in the chronology and logic of the myth, he reigned alone first, and in time he spotted Salacia and made her queen. History, however, seems to be telling a different story in the Roman world. The opposite story, in fact. If Salacia had once ruled the sea without him, then it would seem that there had been a time in the Roman religious landscape when she indeed reigned supreme in her own right, in her salty realm. And just as the Greek myth ended up elevating Neptune, so, at the same time, it ended up demoting Salacia. Maybe it's not such a bad demotion, though, to end up queen consort and a beauty among all the pearly treasures of the deep, riding dolphins, birthing sea monsters, and dancing up the waves. So in the end, denying the Greek aspects of what Salacia evolved into and became would be as unhelpful and foolhardy as trying to deny that there had ever been a Roman goddess beneath that, with other dimensions, and a domain far more rooted in the city of Rome, Roman culture, and the concerns of Roman life. Trying to find Salacia now is like walking down the beach looking for grains of salt among the sand, but I'm pretty sure she's there. And maybe one day some serendipitous discovery from an archaeological dig somewhere will show us who she was. But until then, we must leave her mystery among the silvery caves of the Nereids and the shimmering palace beneath the waves, among all those scallops, clams, and seahorses. The moist race of the vast sea, as the Roman poet Virgil put it, frolicking and scattering the salt spray far and wide.